Welcome to our presentation of the journey to close, a roadmap to increasing your chances for success in a real estate contract. Today, we will talk about the journey from the moment you go under contract all the way through closing and everything in between. My name is Ricardo Teran. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. I'm the co founder and the director of business development for FOLIO Title, where we advise real estate agents, buyers, sellers, and investors on win win real estate transactions. Today's presentation has a different focus than just going through the manual steps of what it takes to do a closing. Really, I think our mindset has to be that to achieve success in a transaction, we have to look at the whole journey, right? Not just the destination. Um, Many people come into a transaction with, the firm focus and expectation of closing, which is understandable. However, in my experience of over 3,000 transactions that I have seen over the last 5 years, um, I believe that many of the issues that happen during a transaction that could be avoided, or could be or could be better managed if they were understood better. And so the reason we set up this presentation was to allow agents to understand better not only their role but the client's role and the role of the role of other people that are involved in the transaction. And we feel that that's going to allow you to better guide your clients, and it's going to better allow you to be guided by us as a title company and as closing agents. Okay. So we want to talk about what are the things we can do to increase our chances of success by knowing what is expected of each person involved and to know what we can expect coming ahead, right? When you go on a journey, you need to have a roadmap and you want to know the milestones that you need to fulfill on the way there. How do you measure progress and how do you know if you're on the right track? That is what we're going to talk about here today. There's going to be several definitions that we're going to explore today. Um, Definitions and words such as the closing agent, the escrow agent, what is title insurance, what is an estoppel versus a survey, what's a reoccupancy certification, lien searches, title searches, and the difference between the title search and the title commitment, association approvals, different kinds of associations, the differences between the loan commitment and the loan estimate and the CD, what is a bank's loan package, what does it mean to have a clear to close, um, some issues around FERPTA. There's a whole other training on FERPTA, um, and some other key initiatives. But first, I think it's very, very important to try and understand what is the title company and what is the role of the closing agent. This is perhaps one of the most important definitions for today and one of the most misunderstood aspects of a closing. The title company has several responsibilities. Right? First, it's an independent intermediary in the real estate transaction, right? It lies between the buyer and the seller, between the bank and the borrower, between the title insurer and the buyer, right? So there are many roles that the closing agent and title company must play. First, they need to review the history of title to the real estate property and ensure that the transfer of the property from the seller to the buyer is properly done, transferring the correct rights and warranties, and that it is transferred in accordance to the terms and conditions of not just the real estate contract, but the practices permitted by the title insurance company and the requirements of the county recorder. Now, as a fiduciary intermediary, right, you'll hear words like closing agent, settlement agent. Uh, we need to collect all the funds and documents associated with the transaction. And when the conditions of the purchase or sale are met, that is when we break the escrow. That is when we hand over keys to the buyers, when we hand over money to the seller, and we take the original documents to the county recorder. Now, it's important to distinguish between the closing agent or settlement agent and the escrow agent. The escrow agent, particularly that agent that is stated on the first page of the as is contract, is simply the company or organization that is holding the deposits on the contract. Okay, so for example, it's very common that a broker could act as the escrow agent, but the real estate broker is not the closing. It's sometimes a bit confusing. So that if you use the broker as the escrow agent, many times the bank will reach out to the broker and ask for documents that are required from the closing. So it's just important to keep in mind that the escrow agent and the closing agent can be different. Folio title as a closing agent can also act as an escrow agent. So it just kind of depends on the preferences of the client and on some of the policies or some of the suggestions that your individual broker can make. Um, Another responsibility of the title or closing agent is to act as an agent of the title insurance company, right? Remember, at the end of the day, we're using this legal due diligence that we perform to provide a title insurance policy to both the buyers as well as the lenders on purchase and sale transactions. So we need to follow not only state law and the actual contract itself, but we need to follow the guidelines of the title insurance underwriter. Now, you're going to hear this word underwriter throughout your transactions quite a lot. There's a lot of confusion. A lot of people believe that underwriters are only work for lenders. But essentially, what is the underwriter? Well, the underwriter is any a person or position that measures and handles risk for an organization, evaluates risk for an organization. So naturally, lenders have underwriters. They are trying to figure out the risk that they're going to take by providing a loan to a certain client, right? Sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's a committee, or an underwriter will provide let's say, the credit committee with their recommendations. Now, title insurance, any kind of insurance really has underwriters as well, right? These underwriters are constantly evaluating risk. They're constantly trying to figure out the conditions that the policy can provide that will protect the client the most without risking the policy, right? That's important to understand because the title insurance company's objective is to protect the buyer at the lowest risk possible, right? It's not it's not logical to think, for example, that a title insurance company is going to underwrite risk for things that they already know exist. For example, if there's a lien on the property that came from a violation, if that is already in the public record, the insurance underwriter is going to say, hey, you need to clear that lien before closing, or simply, I cannot underwrite this risk. I must take it out of the policy, correct? So part of our legal due diligence is to find these risks. Now, lastly, and maybe most important, is that the closing agent acts as a transaction coordinator between the buyers and the sellers, the brokers, the title insurance company, and the lender involved in the transaction. Okay, so we are the center of the action. We are the air traffic control, and having an open and honest dialogue between the closing agent and the parties is very important, especially considering that many times the parties are having bilateral conversation amongst themselves. For example, it's very common that the buyer is talking directly to the lender, but neither the title company nor other people involved know that those conversations are happening. I'm going to give you a very concrete example. It is very, very common that the buyer and the lender talk about moving the closing date for the buyer. However, if the buyer does not inform the title company, we need to use as a guideline the deadlines established in the contract to guide us in the work and the documentation. So if the lender and the buyer have spoken perhaps about doing the closing earlier, the title company has to know about this because we need to ensure that the title can be ready earlier, which is not always possible, but more importantly, that the seller can be ready to provide possession of the property. And especially in a market like we are today, where sellers are having a hard time finding a place to live, the seller may need the entire length of the contract before they can close, even if the bank is ready early. This is particularly important when the bank has done what is called a rate lock. If the bank has locked the interest rate for the client for a period that is shorter than the amount of time of closing on the contract, that may present unnecessary conflict or turbulence in the transaction. This is why we feel it's so important for the title company to act as that transaction coordinator and be informed of these situations. In essence, we are assisting the execution of the contract between the buyer and the seller, between the buyer, also called the borrower, and the lender, and between the buyer, the lender, and the title insurance company. So for this, we have to obtain a title search report and we issue what is called a title commitment. Title commitment is one of the definitions we talked about. It is the insurance company's commitments to provide insurance, title insurance, based on the conditions that were found in the title search and the conditions stated on the title commitment. Okay. The closing agent will work on the transaction and prepare what is called settlement statements, which is essentially an accounting of the debits and credits for both the buyer and the seller. It is a way to keep track of all the money that goes in and all the money that goes out in the transaction, and includes what is known as prorations, right? Prorations are when you take a large amount and you divide it into proportional amounts, right? Such as the property taxes. For example, we would take last year's property taxes on a property divided by 365 and multiply it times the amount of days that the seller was still the owner of the property. That would be a tax proration for the seller. The difference the buyer needs to make, right? So in that case, we would prorate the taxes for the seller and provide the buyer a credit for that amount that the seller needs to pay, so that when the buyer pays the full year taxes, they've already collected the portion of the seller. Okay, all that is involved in the settlement statements. Now we also have to transfer and record the key documents in the public record. That is why we have to stick to not just underwriting guidelines, but also the guidelines of the county recorder, right? So documents, the conveyance documents, seller documents must be approved by the closing agent to ensure that they can record them in the public record. Remember that the closing agent is providing a title policy, a title insurance policy, and they're saying that they are sure that they can provide insurance. However, it's subject to the recording of the conveyance document. So this is why when we do a closing transaction, if a seller has their own independent attorney, we need to approve the seller documentation before it gets executed to ensure that we can correctly record it in the public record. Now, we could also serve as escrow agents, right? Fideicomiso is the word in Spanish. We gather all the money in the transaction and we disperse once all the conditions are cleared and the lender's disbursement instructions are completed, right? And in the end, we are the central hub for communication. Now, title insurance is something that is not always understood, and this is a type of insurance policy that protects the lenders and the buyers from the financial losses due to defects in the title to a property. These mostly come from back taxes or liens or conflicting wills. Now, most insurance most insurances charge an annual or a monthly premium for the life of the asset they're covering. You have car insurance, you pay your car insurance every month, right? Title insurance doesn't work that way. Title insurance has one policy premium at the beginning of the transaction that covers you for the life of for the entire ownership period of the person who got the title insurance and includes their heirs. So if any of the people who got title insurance pass away and that property is inherited, those heirs are covered. It's important to recognize that title insurance practices differ based on states, right? State law governs title insurance. However, there are certain federal requirements that impact title insurance. What's important to know is that in the state of Florida, the state is the one who sets the rates for title insurance, and the state is the one who sets the has a supervisory responsibility for title insurance. And who pays the title insurance in Florida depends largely on the county where the property is and who is buying and selling. Now, what are the different roles in the transaction? Well, the journey really begins at contract, where you'll have a buyer, you'll have a seller, and you'll have their agents and executing a contract. Now, the contract is executed between the buyer and seller. Those are the only two parties in the contract. Neither the lender nor the title insurance company nor even the agents have responsibilities to each other in the contract. This is a very important reason why I emphasize so emphatically that buyers and sellers need to be able to read the contracts before they get executed. Okay. And what ends up happening is there is so much pressure on the buyer and seller to execute something quickly that they just sign and send, right? If you have a listing agreement with the seller, you could easily provide the seller when you sign the listing agreement with a blank copy of the as is contract, which in South Florida in particular is 98% of the contracts in residential. If you're working with a buyer, it's a good idea to provide a blank copy of the buyer when you start working with them so that they have the time to read through the conditions, ask questions. They can meet with myself or they can meet with their title company, ask them questions and get familiar and comfortable with the requirements of the contract. Now, in addition to the buyer and the seller, once you have an executed contract, you do have an escrow agent on the first page of the contract. These are the people that are going to be responsible for holding the deposit. And then you have the closing agent, whose role we've talked about extensively. You also may have a legal representative on the side of the seller. The seller has every right to get their own legal representative. So, in addition to the buyers, agents, and brokers, and sellers, agents, and brokers, and these agents here in the middle, you also have to consider that the seller may have a mortgage. So, we need to get the seller's lender involved. The buyer may be getting a mortgage. So, we need to get the buyer's lender involved. And many times you have associations, and sometimes more than one association to deal with in the transaction. And each one of these actors plays a different role. You can see why it's so important for this closing agent to be in the middle trying to coordinate. Now, what can we expect from our journey? What are the different stages of the transactions? And how do we know that we are on the right track? Before we embark on our journey, we need to prepare, right? So let's talk about what happens before the contract is executed. First and foremost, if a client needs to get a mortgage loan, they should get pre-qualified. A lender usually provides a loan estimate, which will estimate all closing expenses. Now, many times the buyers ask the title company for a quote for their services, which is totally normal and totally feasible. However, the title company does not have the expenses of the lender. And more importantly, we do not know the requirement that the lender will have for the prepaids and escrows. The prepaids and escrows are those expenses that require prepayment by the client, and the escrows are deposits that each bank requires their borrower to make to reduce the risk of the loan. Just yesterday, I saw a loan estimate where a bank required the buyer to deposit 10 months of prorated property taxes in an account at closing. Another bank's policy was 4 months, right? So depending on the bank, depending on the time of the year, depending on the risk profile of the client, the bank will let you know what those escrow requirements are. So when they ask the title company for an estimate of the costs, we only provide a partial view. We can only show the costs that are associated with the closing process, including a settlement fee from the title company, including the title insurance, including and including all the buyer paid taxes and recording fees that we know about. Okay. Now, the other issue pre-contract is many people want us to review their contracts. Now, contract review is in high demand, and usually realtors want to submit offers as quickly as possible after they send the contract for review, especially in multiple offer situations. My recommendation is that the buyer and the realtor work on a blank contract to understand more or less the terms and have a conversation with the title company, with myself, before you start submitting offers so that we can get you to the offer as quickly as possible. The last thing about the pre-contract process that I think is important is having the buyers understand how the deposits work, right? Are they going to send it directly to the escrow agent? What are the forms of payment that are accepted? Is it a wire? Is it cash? Pardon, is it a wire? Is it a personal check? Is it a money order? How do we calculate the cash to close? The cash to close essentially is the amount of money that the buyer is projected to bring to the closing table after we have accounted for the deposits, after we have accounted for the loan amount, after we have added the closing costs, right? Those are the cash to close calculations. And many buyers, especially first-time buyers, are nervous. They want to make sure they have enough savings. This is why it's so important to get these loan estimates early in the process, because what the buyer really wants is to understand how much cash they're going to need to close, and taking into account, excuse me, the prepaids and the escrows is going to be fundamental. When you take into account prepaids and escrows, it usually adds 1 to 1.5 percentage points of the purchase price to the cash to close. So it is a relevant number, right? If you're putting 3.5% down on a loan and you need 5% cash to close, the buyer might have thought they only had to bring 3.5%, but in reality, 3.5% plus 5% cash to close is 8.5%. So, buyers need to be ready for that. Borrowers need to be ready, and they will be ready if they closely review the numbers and the contract before they execute. Now, one of the important aspects of today's presentation is understanding the different points of view of the from the client and the realtor, but also from the closing. So a client and a realtor basically are looking at three phases of the contract: the inspection, the financing period, and the closing. In reality, the closing agent is doing different work throughout the stages of the contract, and we include something called pre-closing and post-closing. Now, let's look at the world from the realtor and the client's point of view. In the inspection period, it is very important that anything related to the physical inspection of the property is done. This is also called the physical diligence period, and it can include not just home inspections with a certified inspector, right, doing mold inspection, 4-point, and wind mitigation. It could also include the search of the original blueprints in the city, especially if you visited the house and you believe, for example, that the garage was converted without permits, or there's a pool that looks like it was built recently. You want to figure out if the what the blueprints of the house are registered in the city, right? Now, in the inspection period, there is an actual inspection period defined by the contract, right, in the residential contract, or is also known as the due diligence period in the commercial contracts and vacant land. In the residential inspection period, clients can cancel during this period for any reason without risking their deposit, assuming that they're using good faith and diligent effort in the contract. During the financing period, this is when we're looking to ensure clear and marketable title. We're looking to understand the title defects that may come up on the title and try to cure them with the seller. Um, the buyers and the lenders are working together to get the loan approved, right? Their underwriter is looking at credit worthiness, the ability to repay, the risk evaluation of the property. And if there's an association present, the banks also have to evaluate the risk of the association. Some of you may have heard of condo questionnaires and things like of that nature. That is the lender doing their due diligence on the association. Now, this stage usually lasts about 15 to 45 days, okay, after the inspection period is over. The closing agent and the lender are working in parallel. And sometimes the lender is ready before the title company is ready, or vice versa. The title company could be ready before the lender. But it's very important to understand that the file is not ready until several things happen. First, the lender has it cleared to close, which means that underwriting has approved all the conditions and is ready to provide a loan package and fund. That also means that they have provided the necessary closing disclosures to the client and that the client has signed those closing disclosures. But it also means that title has officially called for closing. The bank is not the institution that says we're ready to close. It is the title company. And this sometimes generates friction because the loan officers are usually in communication with the buyer and they're saying, hey, we're ready to close. But in reality, the back office of the lender, the closer at the lending company, the underwriter, they might not be fully ready to close because they have not been able to finalize the CD, or they have not been able to finalize a closing package. And the title company won't be able to call the client and say, hey, we're closing on such a date at such a time in such a location until those things are done. So my recommendation is when you are talking to the loan officer and the bank, call your title processor, call the transaction coordinator, and the three of us can coordinate that final signature, right, for closing. Now, for closing, it's when the buyer, the seller, and the closing agent are ready to close. The closing agent coordinates and calls for closing when all the conditions have been met. The conditions between the buyer and the seller, the conditions between the buyer and the lender, the conditions between the buyer and the title insurance company, and the conditions between the lender and the closing, right? The lender and the closing agent is essentially um, that last coordination that is necessary. Sometimes it takes half a day, sometimes it takes 2 days. It's very important to understand that every closing is different, every lender has different policies. However, title companies do not schedule closings until they have clarity that a loan package will be provided on such a date and such a time, and that we have a final CD. Some of you that have participated in closings, maybe it's happened to you, but you have your clients at the closing table and the bank still has not provided a loan package. Unfortunately, when volume gets very, very high as it is now, sometimes that happens. It also may have happened to you that the bank is completely ready, but the title company is missing a document, maybe an estoppel letter, or maybe a proof of payment of a credit card, let's say. So, there's a lot of things that are going on during a transaction. So I think what's most important is to be proactive, but also to be patient and understand who is doing what, which is what we're going to talk about now. These are some of the milestones that you will see that the client and the realtor need to get done during the transaction. So during the inspection period, the buyer is providing the deposits, doing the inspections, doing the loan application, a condo application. They're receiving the condo docs for review. They're reviewing any leases if applicable. And the seller is providing the condo docs and the lease. Just yesterday, I had a case where the seller does not have the condo docs. They're telling the buyer, hey, I'm letting you know I don't have the condo docs, so they're your problem. And the contract says that the condo docs need to be provided by the seller. And so if the buyer wants to buy the condo docs, the seller should be willing to pay for them and reimburse them at closing. These are things that the agents really should speak about. Now, during the due diligence and financing period, the buyer is usually doing their second deposit. We're reviewing the title results, obtaining a loan commitment, and obtaining the condo approval, while the seller is preparing their documentation either with the title company or with their independent attorney, and they're trying to clear the conditions that came up on the title commitment, including corporate requirements. If the seller is a company, whether an LLC or a corporation, there may be corporate requirements. So I'll give you a quick example. If you have the owner of a property, let's say as an LLC or a corporation in Florida, maybe the shareholders of that corporation are offshore. If that company is offshore, there is a whole series of documents that are required to ensure that the owners of the offshore company have approved all the documents and the actual transaction. And so the title company will provide the seller or their representative with a list of all the conditions and documents that are required, including the corporate requirements. At closing, the buyer and the seller do a walkthrough. The buyer has to wire the cash to close. Many times the buyer is calling 3, 4 days before the closing saying, I need to know the amount of the cash to close. Until the CD is final, we can only provide an estimate, okay? And it is not a good idea usually to use the closing disclosure sent by the lender because many lenders do not update the final numbers until after the CD has been signed, which means if your buyer does a wire too early, they might not have enough money and they may need to go back, right? This is not only expensive, but sometimes it's not possible to do more than one wire. We need to ensure the condo and the loan approval are in the name of the title holders, and we need to, get a loan package ready for signing. Sellers need to ensure that all the title conditions were cleared and that the seller documents were executed. Now, let's look at the world from the closing agent's point. What are the closing agent's milestones during this period? Well, in the inspection, we order title search and lien search. We provide the lenders with title documents that they request, including the pre-CD, and we onboard the client. That basically means we talk to the client, we tell them what they should expect, and we usually like to give them an estimate of some of the expenses, and we like to have calls with them to answer any questions or doubts that they may have. Everybody has a friend who's a realtor, everybody has a friend who has bought or sold. So everybody out on the street has advice for buyers and sellers. I think it is important that buyers and sellers have an opportunity to talk to the closing agent and ask their questions, um, so that during the inspection period, they can make the best decision possible. During the financing period, we're ordering the survey or coordinating the estoppel. We're reviewing the title commitment, the lien search, the other documents that we have to get ready. We have to ensure the title conditions are cleared to be able to call for closing. We have to prepare the final HUDs and CDs with the lender and receive the lender package and execute with the client. Now, the complexity of the closing process depends on several factors, right? There's six main factors that we've identified that really will determine what path we will take on this journey to close. The first is the type of financing. Cash deals are much easier to execute because there's one huge actor that is not involved in the transaction, which is the lender. Usually, cash transactions take much less. However, all the conditions for title and for association stay the same, right? So we're only skipping the lender. Now, the mortgage loan, when you get a mortgage loan or a private loan, that will change very much the amount of complexity in the transaction. The complexity will also change depending on the type of seller, right? If the seller is an individual or a legal entity, there will be, different requirements. If the individuals are foreigners, that will have other requirements, especially if the seller is a foreigner. And if the sellers are legal entities, that has additional requirements, right? So the type of seller involved in the transaction is going to determine an important amount of complexity in that transaction. The type of property also determines some of the complexity. If it is a condo or has a homeowners association, if it's a co-op or a single family home, there will be different actions, different requirements that we will have. So for example, in a condo, you need a condo approval in 98% of the cases. That condo approval needs to be in the name of the title holder. So if your buyer is an individual, the condo approval needs to be in the name of the individual. If the buyer is a legal entity, the condo approval must be in the name of the legal entity, and that will be recorded in the public record. What tends to happen often is that the individuals apply early to the condo, and later in the transaction, they assign the contract to a company, but they don't tell the condo association that they need the approval in the name of the company. And so we get an approval 3 days before closing in the name of the individuals, and we have to basically stop the closing and wait for the condo to give us a new condo approval. Sometimes that takes an hour, sometimes that takes a week. So it's very important that you are aware of that and that you can guide the buyer and the condo. Should condos know this rule? Yes, they should. However, they don't always know that the contract is being assigned to a company. So the buyer is the one who needs to inform the condo. Another source of complexity is where the location is happening. We're one of the few title companies that is able to close outside of the United States using different methods, whether it's remote online notarization, local notaries, etc. It's very different than if you're going to do the closing here at your office or in another state of the United States where we can send a mobile notary, or if we're going to close, let's say, in Venezuela or in Colombia, right? There's a lot more logistics if the parties are not present. Now, the post-closing occupancy is an important topic, right? Because if the property is going to be provided vacant, that's kind of quote unquote easy, right? The seller is going to give the keys, they're going to leave the property. Now, if the property is subject to a tenant lease, this is very important because most banks, if you're getting a loan, require, depending on the loan type, that you take possession of the property in a certain amount of time. So it's very important to figure this out before we do the contract or before we execute. Now, sometimes the owner needs to stay post closing. For example, it's happening a lot now where owners are not being able to find properties fast enough and they need the money from the sale of the property to buy another property. And so in the contract, we must make sure that this condition is stated and that we know what it means for the transaction. A couple of other factors, for example, reoccupancy inspections and certificates. There are several cities in Miami, in South Florida, Miami Shores, Hialeah, West Miami. All of these require reoccupancy inspections and certificates. The reoccupancy inspection has to be coordinated and paid for by the seller. Some reoccupancy inspections take 30 days, okay? And so it is highly recommended that you know which cities require reoccupancy and that you can guide your client um, to apply for this reoccupancy, okay? The last, factor of complexity is probate. If there has been a seller who is deceased, this requires very special attention. If, for example, there was a husband and a wife and one of the parties passed away, it is very important to understand if the property is now in the name of the spouse, if there are estate taxes that are due. There's many factors that we need to understand. Now, the more you find out about the status of the probate, the better. The probate is a legal proceeding where you need to go to court for a judge to be able to determine who is going to manage the assets of the estate. This is really important because if there is a probate and there is no joint tenant that had the right of survivorship, the judge has to appoint the representative of the estate that is the one who must sign the contracts. And later, the judge needs to approve the actual sale. So when there is a probate involved, it is important to understand the stage of the probate, and it is important to provide a clear expectation to the buyer in particular that sometimes probates can take 6 months. Now, if there is already an order that determined the personal representative or an order determining homestead, those things significantly speed up the process. If you see that the owner of the property is the estate of, that immediately tells you that that is a property where there is somebody who is deceased. We need to collect the probate documents to figure out how far ahead they are and to know more or less how long it will take. So if you are getting a loan with a 30-day interest rate lock, and for example, the personal representative of the probate has not been determined, you probably should stop the transaction because it will likely take at least 60 to 90 days to get that result. Now let's talk about the role that each party plays inside of the transaction in each stage. So in the inspection, we talked about making the deposits for the buyer. We talked about performing the physical inspections and applying for financing. The buyer needs to decide whether to accept or reject the um, condition of the property, the buyer must apply for the association. This is important. There are buyers who do not want to spend money on the application until they know if they're going to be approved or until the appraisal comes out. The contract says that you need to apply in a certain amount of time, and it is usually within the inspection period. This must be explained to the client. The buyers also need to provide necessary information and documents to the closing agent, their IDs, their contact information, their social security number, the lender's information, etc. From the sellers, they need to provide access for inspections and appraisal and decide on whether they're going to hire an independent attorney or not. If you are a listing agent, you should encourage your sellers to get an independent representative, an independent attorney. They otherwise the title company will do their documents and charge them anyway. If the seller has a copy of the prior title policy, it is very, very helpful to provide to the closing agent, okay, a copy of that policy, okay. Now, the realtors are usually the ones delivering the escrow checks or money orders. If the escrow is with their broker, the realtor needs to facilitate the escrow letter. They usually help coordinate the physical inspections between the inspector and the listing agent, assisting the buyer with lender requirements, negotiating repairs, and they begin to coordinate the file with the closing agent. Very, very important that when the title company gives you the key dates in the transaction, you review them with your client, you review them with the lender, because the key dates given by the title company are the official dates in the transaction. If you see an error, you must make it aware to the title company, because otherwise the title company will use that as a guide for the rest of the transaction. Okay. Now the lenders here are going to provide the loan application, and they're going to provide the initial loan disclosures. For the lender to provide the initial disclosures, they are going to they're going to ask the title company for certain information, which we must provide. Now, the closing agent is onboarding the file once a contract is fully executed. We are ordering our title search and our lien search, providing the escrow letter for the escrow agent, giving you the official dates of the transaction, providing the lender with title work they need for their disclosures, and we're trying to get from the realtors the instructions of how they want their commissions dispersed, okay? During financing, the buyer or borrower is providing documents to the lender, especially including the quoting and choosing of a homeowner's insurance policy. Very important. The buyer should shop around for insurance as early as possible. If the buyer can find an insurance policy, but the insurance is too expensive, that is not a reason for the buyer to get out of the contract and have their deposit protected. So the earlier you shop for insurance, the earlier you're going to know how much you're going to pay, okay? We're looking for conditional loan approval from the lender. We're following up with the association, the buyer, for their condo approval in the name of the title holder. And the title company will provide the results of the documents that we have ordered for the review of the buyer. The sellers are waiting, and if they hear of title defects, then they need to start working on clearing the title conditions, and they need to start getting prepared to move out and clean and provide possession and closing. The realtors are usually coordinating the appraisal with the listing agent during this period. They're assisting buyers with requirements. They're coordinating with us, the title company, and they're monitoring the timelines on the contract. For example, if there's an appraisal contingency, the realtor has to know that there is a deadline to get the appraisal done and work with the buyer and the bank on it. The lenders are coordinating the appraisal report, and they're going to continue underwriting the loan to get the conditional loan approval. The closing agent is usually ordering the survey and the estoppels in this period, as well as payoffs from the seller's mortgages. We need to approve the conveyance documents, which are either prepared by the title company or the seller's attorney. The closing agent is looking to ensure clear and marketable title. So we are reviewing the title commitment. We're understanding the municipal lien search. we're looking for encroachments or easements on the survey. And on the estoppel, we are looking for to communicate any violations and reflecting them on the HUD. We are also auditing the file to get it ready for closing. This is very important because here is when we start looking at some of the projected expenses that will be coming out on the contract. Now, as we get ready for the closing, the buyers are finishing their loan conditions. They need to sign the closing disclosure provided by the lender. And once that closing disclosure is signed, the bank will provide it to the title company. Once the title company receives the closing disclosure, we begin preparing the final HUD. Once we have the final HUD, we can provide the final cash to close to the buyer. Now, this is a period of extraordinary stress for buyers and sellers. And in my opinion, one of the most important roles of the agents is to set the correct expectation. A good title company will be available to talk to you during this period and to talk to the buyers and sellers, explain to them what's happening, where they are in the process. And if there is no final cash to close, they could probably provide you an estimate. But when the loan officer tells the buyer that they are ready and that they provided the estimates to the title company, that does not mean that the final estimates are ready. Okay. So we need to get association approval. Not to plan logistic commitments like moving trucks, moving people, until we know the closing agent has called for closing. Okay. Why? Because many buyers have a moving truck waiting outside their door the day that the lender told them that they were going to be ready to close. But they do not have confirmation from the title company. They do not know if the seller documents have arrived. They do not know what the final prorations are going to be. They might not even have wired the cash to close. So it's very important that before commitments are set in stone, that we have a conversation so that we can give you a vision of what it's going to take to close. The buyer has to wire the cash to close to the closing agent, usually the day before closing or the day of closing. We need to receive a lender package with all the closing documents, and we need to ask the borrower to come in on a certain day to execute that loan package. Now, the seller's conveyance documents, where they're transferring their rights and title to the seller needs to sign. So, for example, on an FHA loan, there is documents in the lender package that the seller has to sign. If the seller executed the conveyance documents a few days before closing, they may not have access to this FHA document. So they need to sign it later electronically. The realtors need to coordinate the walkthrough as well as coordinating the keys between the buyer and the seller. Some sellers prefer to give the keys to the closing agent. Other sellers prefer to give it at the walkthrough. Other sellers leave it in the apartment or with the condominium association for the buyer to pick up. The if the escrow agent is the broker, the realtor must coordinate the disbursement of those deposits to the closing agent. Okay, that usually should happen about 7 days before closing. So if the deposit went to the broker must send that money to the closing. Okay, and again, we talked about the realtor setting the right expectations. All right. Now, lenders are looking to provide a clear to close. They're looking to send out the CD and the loan package, and they need to send the funds to the closing agent. The closing agent cannot close if the lender has not wired the funds. It is important that you know that some lenders require funding authorization. Others do not require funding authorization. The ones that require funding authorization require you to submit all the documents from closing for them to approve them. If your buyer is going to do a closing after 3 o'clock, that may mean that the loan is not going to close that day. Because if the authorization comes after 5 p.m., the closing agent cannot wire the funds on the same day. Please be aware that there are many lenders whose closing departments are on the West Coast. So if they get you an answer at 5 p.m. West Coast time, that's 8 p.m. local time. And that means the wire departments are closed. So we need to understand these things to set the right expectations for the buyer. Now, what are we doing during the closing? Well, we cannot call for closing unless conditions have been met, including that original conveyance docs are delivered to us and that we know how the keys will be accessed. We need to balance the final CD with the lender. We need to provide a cash to close or an estimate to the buyer and receive the buyer's funds. We need to get the lender's package and coordinate the execution of the packages. We need to ensure we've received any escrow deposits from the escrow agent. And we need to prepare the payments that we're going to make to the different people on the settlement statement, including the seller, the mortgage payoff, if there are any taxes due, the realtor commissions, etc. Now, for post-closing, the buyers move in and we provide them an executed warranty deed if they need to submit to an association and a final HUD to the buyers. Usually the actual physical title policy takes 90 to 120 days to provide. So the buyer usually does not have their title policy until 3 or 4 months after. Okay. Now, once the conveyance is finalized, they're the legal owners. However, the title company has to take a few days to record the documents in the public record. Now, for sellers, there is one issue that can become a lien on the property that sellers must know, and that is any pending water bills. If the lien search reflects a pending water bill, the seller must pay that bill and they must provide a copy of the final bill to the title company because the title company is going to collect an escrow for the water. Okay, the title company is not going to pay for the water. They're just going to collect a deposit. They're going to wait for proof that the payment was made, and then they're going to send the escrow back to the seller. Realtors have to coordinate if they're going to pick up their checks, if they want their checks mailed, if they want a wire instruction. We provide them a copy of the executed HUD or ALTA for their broker. And here's where we set up a celebration with the client. Sometimes champagne bottles are brought in or pictures or whatnot. This is the moment where we want to celebrate with the client. Okay. So in the end, we will act like your guide on this journey, right? Think of us as the title Sherpa. We will act like a guide from the contract through the closing. Okay. And so now that you have an overview of what are the roles of everybody in the transaction, what are the different stages in the transaction, now you're ready to begin this journey with us as your title company. We will take you by the hand throughout the entire process. We have our transaction coordinators like Dylan and like myself that will guide you throughout the transaction, answer your questions, answer your clients' questions so that the experience could be as optimal, as successful, as stress-free as possible. Here is a list of all our services that you can find on our website, foliotitle.com. We do commercial and residential closings. We do for sale by owners. We do short sale negotiations and 1031 exchanges, FERPTA, remote online notarizations. We do international closings. You can find a list of this and much more at foliotitle.com. And with that, I thank you very much for joining us in today's presentation. I hope this helps clarify the journey from contract to closing, and I look forward to speaking to all of you very soon. Thank you.